At some point in life, everyone stops and wonders, what am I really chasing? Is it happiness, success, peace, or am I simply trying to escape pain? I asked myself the same questions at the age of 76, sitting alone on the old wooden bench in my courtyard. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor, but I was still stuck in a different kind of shadow, one that had followed me for years. People often say that sorrow makes you stronger, but nobody tells you how quietly it breaks you first. My name is Abdul Qayyum, and what I'm about to share with you is not just my story. It might be yours too. It's the story of a man who had everything people pray for, yet still found himself drowning in silence. I was once a respected businessman, running a textile shop in the heart of Lahore. My children were well settled, my home was large, and my wife, she was my soul. Life looked perfect from the outside, but that's the thing about sorrow. It doesn't care about appearances. It waits quietly, builds slowly, and then one day, it arrives uninvited. My story begins on a rainy Thursday when my wife passed away in her sleep. It wasn't sudden. She had been unwell for a few months, but when it happened, the silence that followed was unbearable. I remember standing in our room, staring at the bed we had shared for over 40 years, and realizing she would never sleep in it again. The rain outside didn't stop that day, and neither did my thoughts. I sat in the room for hours after everyone left, unable to cry, unable to speak. Something inside me had shut down. That was the first time I truly felt what sorrow was. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, like a door closing softly behind you, locking you in a room you can't escape. In the weeks that followed, people came and went. They said kind words, they offered food, they told me to be strong. But at night, when the house was empty and the echo of my own footsteps was the only sound I heard, I realized something no one talks about. Sorrow doesn't need company. It thrives in silence. I started losing interest in the things I once loved. I stopped going to the shop. I stopped watering the plants my wife used to care for. I stopped answering calls. My children lived in other cities, busy with their own families. They called, yes. They even visited. But something had shifted. I was there, but not really. My heart was living in memories while my body moved through a life that no longer felt like mine. One day I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally. His eyes weren't sad, they were empty. And that, I realized, was even worse. I had become a guest in my own life, waiting for something to change, but not knowing what. That's when I made a decision. I would leave everything behind and go to the village I was born in, a small place near Jhelum, where time moved slowly and people still sat under trees and talked about things that mattered. I told no one. I packed a small bag, left a letter for my children, and boarded a bus at dawn. It took 6 hours to reach. The roads were bumpy, the air smelled of rain and soil, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. I wasn't running from life. I was going back to find what I had lost: peace. The house I had inherited from my father was still standing, though tired and dusty. I opened the door and the sound of creaking wood welcomed me like an old friend. I swept the floor, cleaned the windows, and made tea on a stove that barely worked. But it didn't matter. I wasn't seeking comfort. I was seeking truth. In the days that followed, I started waking up at Fajr, walking to the nearby mosque, and sitting under the banyan tree afterward. I began talking to people, not about business or politics, but about life, about faith, about silence. And slowly something changed. I started hearing myself again. I started feeling again. I met an old man there about my age named Usman. He was a retired school teacher and he had lived in the village all his life. One day we sat under the tree and he said, "You know what the real secret of peace is? It's not in avoiding sorrow, it's in understanding it." That sentence stayed with me. I began thinking, maybe sorrow wasn't my enemy. Maybe it was a message, a door to something deeper. Maybe all this time, I had been trying to silence my pain instead of listening to it. One night, while sitting alone, I picked up an old diary I had brought with me. It was empty. I wrote a single line: "I miss her." Then I kept writing. Page after page, I wrote about our memories, our arguments, our quiet mornings, our dreams, our disappointments. I wrote until my hand hurt and my eyes blurred. And by the time I closed the diary, I realized something had lifted. Not because I had forgotten her, but because I had allowed my... Sometimes we think we've made peace with the past until the past knocks again, quietly, unexpectedly, and in ways that remind us we never truly healed. After settling in the village, my days became simpler, and on the surface I appeared content. But peace, real peace, doesn't just come from new surroundings or silence. It comes from confronting what's been hiding in your heart for years. I started having dreams again, not ordinary ones. These were memories, relived. In one dream, I was back in my childhood home. I could hear my mother humming a lullaby while she cooked over a wood fire. The smell of roti, the sound of my father reciting Quran in the next room. It all came rushing back, clear and painful. I woke up sweating, my heart pounding. And that's when I realized sorrow doesn't begin with old age. It begins much earlier. My childhood wasn't sad, but it wasn't soft either. My father was a religious man, stern and disciplined. He loved us, no doubt, but he believed love was shown through silence, through providing, not through touch or words. I remember once falling from a tree and scraping my knee badly. I ran inside crying. My mother wrapped a cloth around it, kissed my forehead, but my father stood by the door and simply said, "Be a man." I was only 9. That one sentence stayed with me for decades. Be a man, don't cry, don't feel, don't show weakness. And so I grew up learning to wear masks, to smile when hurting, to nod when confused, to stay quiet when all I wanted was to scream. As I grew older, I buried these parts of myself. I got married, had children, built a business, became what the world called a strong man. But now, sitting alone under the shade of a banyan tree in my old village, I wondered, was I ever strong or just emotionally numb? One day I found a box in the storeroom of the old house. Inside were letters my mother had written but never sent. Some were to me, some were to Allah, some were to her own younger self. One letter broke me. She wrote, "Qayyum is kind, but I wish he'd talk to me more. I wish he'd let me see the boy inside the man. Maybe his silence is his pain." I sat with that letter in my lap for hours, unable to breathe. My mother had seen what I had hidden from myself, that my silence wasn't strength, it was sorrow left unspoken. That night I didn't sleep. I sat with my journal and wrote a letter to her, as if she were still here. "Ami, I'm sorry. I thought being quiet was being strong. I thought men don't need to talk. But I was wrong. I miss you. I wish I had said more when you were alive. I wish I had told you I loved you every day." As I wrote those words, something cracked inside me, and something else healed. For the first time in years, I cried. Not the kind of crying people see, the kind that shakes your chest, that makes your insides ache, but somehow leaves your soul lighter. That's when I realized sorrow isn't always about losing others. Sometimes it's about losing the chance to say what needed to be said. The days passed and I began visiting the village madrasa regularly. I started teaching basic Quran reading to young boys. One of them, Hamza, reminded me of myself. Quiet, observant, always the last to speak. One day after class, I asked him, "Why don't you talk much?" He shrugged. I said, "It's okay to speak, even if you think no one understands." His eyes welled up. He whispered, "Abba says boys shouldn't talk too much." I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "Boys who talk grow up to be men who understand. Don't let the world teach you silence like it taught me." That small conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that maybe my pain could serve someone else. Maybe that's the beginning of purpose, when your wounds become someone else's healing. I began noticing something strange. The more I allowed myself to feel, to write, to talk about my past, the lighter I felt, not happier, just more real. And realness, I discovered, is more comforting than any illusion of strength. I met a woman in the village, not in a romantic way. Her name was Farida. She was in her 60s, a widow like me, and ran a small herbal clinic. She had sharp eyes and a sharper mind. One day while serving tea, she asked me, Why do you always look like you're remembering something sad? I smiled. Because I always am. She laughed. Then maybe you should share it instead of carrying it like a secret burden. That sentence hit me hard. For so long, I had treated my pain like a private enemy, something to hide. But what if it was simply a part of me that wanted to be understood? I started opening up. To her, to the children, to myself. And with every conversation, every confession, I began to notice that sorrow wasn't leaving me. It was becoming familiar, like a scar that no longer hurts when touched. One evening, sitting by the river, Farida told me her story. She had lost her husband in a flood, raised two children alone, and still managed to serve the village through her. Somewhere along the journey, the body gives out before the soul does. That's what I learned in my third month in the village. I had found a routine that gave me peace: early prayers, simple meals, quiet evenings. I had even begun sharing my stories with others. But peace is never a constant. It's something you fight for, something you lose and find again. One morning I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't pain, just a pressure, like something inside me was sinking. I tried to ignore it. I had always been the type to say, "It's nothing, it'll pass." But that day, it didn't pass. By the afternoon, my legs felt weak. My hands trembled as I reached for the glass of water beside my bed. I dropped it. The sound of the glass shattering on the floor echoed louder than it should have. I sat down, breathing slowly, trying to make sense of what was happening. Farida came by later that day to bring herbal tea, and when she saw my face, she stopped cold. "You don't look well," she said. I smiled weakly. "I don't feel well either." She insisted we go to the clinic. I didn't argue. The local doctor took my blood pressure, checked my heart rate, and said calmly, "You need rest. Deep rest. Your body's tired, and so is your mind." That night, I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, my body still, my thoughts racing, and in that darkness, something inside me cracked, not physically, emotionally, spiritually. I started crying, not because of pain or fear of death, but because I finally realized I had spent my whole life trying to be in control, and now for the first time, I wasn't. I whispered into the empty room, "Ya Allah, I don't know what to do." And for the first time, I wasn't asking to be saved. I was just admitting that I was lost. It felt like a collapse, but it wasn't defeat. It was surrender. The next morning, I didn't get out of bed at dawn. I prayed Fajr lying down. I couldn't walk to the mosque, but my heart felt lighter. It was like something invisible had been lifted off my chest. Not the illness, but the illusion that I could handle everything alone. I started seeing everything differently. The trees outside my window, the children's laughter in the distance, the sound of the rooster at sunrise. It all felt louder, clearer, more alive. Like the world had always been whispering peace to me, but I had been too busy holding my sorrow tight to hear it. In the days that followed, I wrote more than ever. I wrote letters to my children, letters I didn't plan to send. I wrote to my wife again, I wrote to my younger self, and I wrote to Allah. Pages and pages of raw, broken, honest words. I told him about my regrets. I asked forgiveness. I thanked him for the small moments of joy. And sometimes I simply said, "I'm here. I'm trying." Farida brought me food daily now. Her son Hamid came to read Quran at my bedside. The villagers, once strangers, began stopping by. They brought fruit, honey, prayers, and most importantly, presents. And slowly I began to realize something beautiful. Surrender doesn't mean weakness. It means you stop resisting what your soul already knows to be true. That you were never meant to carry everything alone. That peace isn't about perfection, it's about presence. I began to feel Allah's mercy not in miracles, but in the ordinary, in warm tea, in a cool breeze, in someone remembering to bring my favorite bread. I remembered a hadith my father used to say when I was a child. "Verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest." I had heard it 1,000 times, but now for the first time, I felt it. Real sukoon isn't in having all the answers. It's in finally asking the right questions. Who am I without my titles? Who am I when I can't move, can't plan, can't lead? Who am I when I simply am? And the answer came, quietly. I am a servant, that's all. That's enough. That's everything. The more I surrendered, the more peace found me. I stopped planning my days, I started living them. One moment at a time, one prayer at a time, one breath at a time. Some days I couldn't write, some days I couldn't speak. But even in silence, I felt heard. Even in stillness, I felt held. That, I realized, was the difference between sorrow and sukoon. Sorrow isolates. Sukoon includes. Sorrow says, you are alone. Sukoon says, you were never alone. One afternoon, as I lay in bed, I heard the children reciting Quran in the madrasa nearby. Their voices were soft but clear, and something in those verses wrapped around my heart like a blanket. I whispered, Alhamdulillah. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had finally stopped fighting what was real. I looked at my trembling hands and said, you've done enough. I looked at my weak legs and said, you've walked far enough. I looked at my tired face in the mirror and said, you're still here. That's enough. That night I had a dream. I was walking in a wide open field. The sky was orange, and they say closure comes in many forms. A conversation, a letter, a moment of silence. For me, closure arrived in a way I never expected, through a knock on the door that interrupted the stillness of my surrender. It was a Thursday morning, the air heavy with clouds, the smell of rain on its way. I had just finished a slow, quiet prayer when I heard it. 3 knocks, firm, hesitant. I rose from my mat, walked carefully to the front, and opened the door. And there they stood, my son Kamran, his wife Saima, and behind them, my granddaughter Alina. I froze. For a moment I thought I was dreaming again. My son looked older, tired. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. He spoke first. Assalamu alaikum, Abba. I replied softly, Wa alaikum salam. There was a pause, the kind that holds decades of unsaid words. Can we come in? He asked. I nodded and stepped aside. Inside, everything felt still. The small house that had become my sanctuary now held the ghosts of what once was. They sat on the old charpai. My granddaughter wandered around, curious. I poured tea silently. My hands shook slightly, but I managed. After a few sips, Cameron finally said, I'm sorry, Abba. We should have come sooner. I looked at him, not with anger, but with deep tiredness. Why now? I asked. He hesitated. We received your letters, all of them. Saima read them first. Then Alina asked questions. And I didn't know how to answer, so we came. I didn't say anything. I just listened. He continued, I thought giving you space was respecting your independence. I didn't know it felt like abandonment. His voice cracked. I thought you preferred being alone. I smiled faintly. I learned to prefer it. That's not the same thing. We sat in silence, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, just necessary. Then Saima spoke. We miss you. The house feels empty. We didn't know how to invite you back after so much distance. I turned to her. You don't invite back what never left. I was always there, in the photos, in the duas, in the quiet you heard but didn't name. My granddaughter came forward, holding one of my old diaries. Did you really write to Grandma every week? I nodded. She smiled gently. I'd like to read them sometime. That's when the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just soft streams down my cheeks. I had let go of the need to be understood, and in that letting go, I had finally been seen. They stayed for 3 days. We talked about my wife, about my childhood, about regrets. Kamran and I walked through the village, slow and quiet. He asked about the banyan tree, about the madrasa, about the children I now taught. I told him everything, not as a father preaching, but as a man remembering. On the last evening, we sat under the stars. He turned to me and asked, Abba, are you at peace here? I looked up at the night sky and answered, I am. But peace isn't a place, it's a state of being. I found it when I stopped needing everything to make sense. He asked, do you want to come back with us? I smiled. Not yet. This place still has more to teach me, and maybe you still have more to learn from being without me. He nodded. There was no offense, just understanding. That's what happens when sorrow has done its job. It leaves room for love to speak. Before they left, Kamran hugged me. For the first time since he was a boy, he held on longer than I did. He whispered, "Forgive me." I whispered back, "I already did." They drove off that morning, and as the dust settled on the village road, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Wholeness. Not perfection. Wholeness. The story had no dramatic ending, no sudden healing, but it had truth. And truth, I learned, is the final form of peace. In the weeks that followed, I continued my routines. I taught, I prayed, I wrote, but I also began recording my voice, sharing the journey, one story at a time, one breath at a time. I didn't do it for fame or attention. I did it because maybe somewhere someone needed to know. Sorrow is not a curse, it is a compass, and peace is not a destination. It is a return to self, a return to God, a return to what always was, hidden beneath everything we thought we had to be. In my final journal, I wrote, "The secret of sorrow and peace is that they are not enemies. Sorrow humbles the heart. Peace settles in it. One prepares, the other enters." And now, as I sit watching the sun dip behind the hills, I know something I never knew when I had money, success, family, or youth. I know how to be with myself, how to sit with pain, how to welcome silence, how to talk to my Lord without asking for anything, just being. That is the final secret. When you stop resisting sorrow, it becomes your teacher. When you stop chasing peace, it finds you. And when you stop pretending to be whole, you finally start healing. This is not the end of the story, but it is the end of the search. I am no longer a man looking for peace. I am